Do you know what a medial woman is? I didn't until I found Dr. Roberta Corson's book. And since then, my mind has been totally blown and I have felt totally validated on multiple levels. A medial woman is one who is a connecting link between seen and unseen realms. She bridges opposites and she helps restore lost wisdom to those who have forgotten. Now, there are shadow aspects as well, and there are medial men as well as medial women. Dr. Roberta Corson is a retired clinical depth psychologist and United Methodist clergy. She holds a BA in English Literature from Lawrence University, a Master of Divinity from Pacific School of Religion, and a PhD from Pacifica Graduate Institute, one of my favorite institutions. And with her depth psychology, she has really brought into the space of our discussion archetypes, one of my favorite things to talk about, and how this medial woman archetype probably describes a lot of us who feel like we're bridge people. We're kind of holding space and paradox and kind of having a foot in each world, the unseen and the seen, unaware. And Roberta's book is called Stepping Out of the Shadows, Naming and Claiming the Medial Woman Today. Also, it is not too late to join the Women's Wisdom Circle. We actually launch March 19th, the first day of spring. So this is a time of rebirth. This is a time of coming into the new, embracing a lot of actually what we're talking about on this episode, which is about sitting in the shadow and coming into the light. Obviously, the name of her book, Stepping Out of the Shadows. So part of claiming your space as a walker between worlds is embracing that shadow. So anyway, yes, our Wisdom Circle will definitely embrace that, as well as help you move confidently into your soul path. So you can find more information on my website, cherieburton.com or standspeakshine.com/WWC. Roberta, also known as Bobbie, welcome to the podcast. Grateful to have you.
Hi, Sharia. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, we have a mutual friend, Dr. Jennifer Selig, who I know she was instrumental in getting your book published. She's been a great mentor for me. I got to meet her at Pacifica and learn from her, and she always sends me amazing people. So when she connected us, I was like, oh, well, that's like an interesting title for a book. Give me the book. Oh, for those of you looking on YouTube, I'm just holding it up right here. It's called Stepping Out of the Shadows, Naming and Claiming the Medial Woman Today. So let's start before we get into what a medial woman is, which was, I want to just tell everyone, super, super affirming for me, super validating. But let's talk about, just as a preface, because I know you teach about liminal space, and it's kind of been a buzzword that you hear in various places in the spiritual realm or in the consciousness realm, in the archetypal realm. So maybe just share with us your definition of what liminal space is.
It's really a simple definition, but it's so key to medial women and to make a distinction between a couple of distinctions about it. A limen is simply a doorway, a passageway, a gate. It's so simple. That's what it is. We
Lim. When you say lemon, I'm thinking of a lemon fruit, but you're
had a
saying
lemon,
L
a lemon,
Limin.
E-N, L-I-M.
I think it's IN, lim in.
Whatever. I'm not very good with spelling.
So lemon is the noun, liminal is the description of that
Right.
place.
It means a doorway or a passageway. And I like to think about all the lemons that we cross every day. I mean, when we bring groceries home, we get out of the car, that's the lemon. We bring them into the house, that's a lemon. We open the refrigerator door, the groceries go through a lemon. The lemon is the passageway from one thing to the other. We all know lemons that we live with passageways. We have passageways in our lives, graduations, weddings. Those are lemons. They are a passageway, a door from one thing to the other. So we all know that. But there are two kinds of lemons that I think distinguish everyday liminal space from the space that medial women experience. The experience that most of us have is material lemon. The experience of medial women is standing at the passageway between what is known and what is not known. And that can be the unconscious and the conscious. It can be the material and the spiritual. And my hunch is there are probably lemons in the spiritual realm that we know nothing about. But I mean, there may be other lemons that we don't know about. But medial women are the ones who stand with one foot on each side of that lemon, and they cross back and forth and back and forth.
From
And
the
this
unknown to the known? Is
Mhm.
that or those the two? Okay.
or the spiritual to the material, or the unconscious to the conscious. And all of us have a little medial in us and can do that. But for the medial woman, that is probably the biggest definition, that we are constantly moving back and forth between these realms, gaining information, having insights, using our intuition, and bringing it back from the unknown into the known. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah, and as I was reading, I was struck with, because I think I shared with when you and I talked before, being in the middle path has always really called to me.
Mm.
And it shows up a lot, like, I'm the middle sister between 2 sisters. The number 2 always comes through to me. I was born the second, like, but being in the middle, being a middle child, trying to be in the middle and stay in the middle has been a challenge because I was always taught to choose a side or to go, I guess you could say, more linear or more logic, but I felt like I wanted to play in this like mystical space. And you could
Mhm.
call it the unknown, but it was always like this fight, like, no, this is the known. This is what you will do. This is the path that's right. I always felt something calling me into that liminal, into that liminal medial space of just, hey, why do I have to choose a camp? Why can't I just play?
I
For
love
me,
that.
it felt like just like,
And play.
yeah, play, but also holding tension.
Oh, yes. And well, the word medial is means comes from mediumistic or meaning middle. I mean, the word itself means middle. So we are always in the middle. And you talk about that linear sense of you have to choose a side and go with the side. Medial people are not linear. We're liminal, but we're not linear. We have a whole different sense of time and space, especially when we are connected to that kind of unknown, mysterious, mystic kind of space. That there's nothing linear about that, which can be a real problem for medial women because people in our culture want us to get on with it, go ahead, move forward. And sometimes we need to embrace and move down or through to something that is not even seen in our culture.
Yeah. And I know that you've had a really fascinating past and history yourself of coming into your own place and owning that you are this medial woman.
Mhm.
Otherwise, why would you do a doctoral dissertation and get a degree in archetypal, right?
Book.
Jungian. I think Jungian people, like the reason I nerd out on Jungian psychology and spiritual psychology is because of that, because it is so not logical. Illogical, not illogical in the sense of negative, but just, archetypes themselves, which I want to get into that. But first, yeah, maybe share with our listeners just a snippet of your childhood and how this path found you because you've always been kind of religious and spiritual, and then finding your place on the map has been a bit of a beautiful life story and life path for you.
When I was studying for my psychology licensing degree, it was very, very linear, evidence-based linear, scientific. And I was working in analysis then, and I said, I'm just never going to pass this. I did, but my analyst said, "You're not a duck." Meaning, referring to the ugly duckling story, that I wasn't a duck, I was a swan, and
Mm.
the ducks were the ones who were really good at taking this test, and I did it differently. I was not a duck when I grew up. I really felt like I was the ugly duckling in my family because it was a medical family. My dad and my mom were medical people. I had scientifically based brothers and family friends, and it was all very scientific. And when I was 3, I wanted to go to church, and so they dropped me off at Sunday
You
school.
were 3.
3, and of all the women I interviewed, all of us wanted to go to church when we were very little, and all of us went on our own. Only one went with her family. There
Mm.
were 5 of us in my interview. So when I was very little, and this is true, I think, with the women I interviewed, there's something that's innately spiritual that's longing for that. I always longed for that when I had a choice of books to read for book reviews in middle school, or a choice of reading the book that I was reading for my Sunday school class, or going to a stupid movie. I chose the book. I mean, I always wanted to use the books I would choose in junior high were Peter Marshall, The Prayers of Peter Marshall, Bernadette, The Song of Bernadette, which was just on my family shelf. I would read
Just
anything
really drawn to understanding what spirituality is and how
when
it
I was little. Yeah, when I was young. I read The Robe when I was in 6th grade, and we had to do a dialogue, and when I was in 10th grade, and I chose to do my dialogue between Joan of Arc and Billy Graham. And, nobody else was doing religious dialogues, but that was important to me. And then in high school and college, the service aspect of religion was really important to me. And then I went into seminary, and I was disappointed in that it was more academic and linear than it was spiritual, but
just the advanced theological studies just being
yeah.
very what and you it felt
Right.
black and white or like
Yeah,
the
it
data, the evidence, yeah.
Yeah, it was
That's
dry,
fair.
and I wanted more of the spiritual, so I hung out with, Meister Eckhart, the mystics, and some of those people. So so that was kind of my background. I do not know anything about the word medial. I think most medial women don't. I don't think you had ever heard of it, had you?
No, in fact, I was like, medial sounds like a medium middle. I kind of had an instant knowing that it was going to be resonant with me. Just
Interesting.
the word, but yeah, I know that you were a student of another person who brought that into your space, and then you just hooked into it.
Irene Claremont de Castillo in her book, Knowing Woman. Years ago, I read that for a class, and then I didn't keep in that program, so I didn't really go back to it, but it was like, this was my I knew, how sometimes you know instantly.
Yep.
And 10 years later, I was in graduate school for my doctoral work, and somebody really bashed Tony Wolfe, who was the one who named this archetype. And I thought, I can't stand that. I need to learn more and I need to reclaim Tony Wolfe's work, which is what I did.
Mhm.
Um, so that's where I learned. I was probably in my 40s when I learned the word. It was not for 10 or 15 years later that I really worked with it.
Mhm. So what was it about it that really spoke to you personally? I mean, I know you'd read this Knowing Woman, so it just sort of grabbed you,
Oh,
and then a decade later, you found yourself feeling some passion and some conviction around, "I've got to defend this. I've got to find what this is and parse it out a little bit." Why do you think that is? Why do you think that was calling you to do that? The reason I ask is because I have women who have really uncommon, or so they think, interests or a theme or a topic that's not very explored yet. And they feel a little bit like a renegade or a gadabout just trying to put it together and make it more palatable, whether it's something that's a resurgence of a topic that no one's really gone into depth with, or if it's something new that they've heard about. So that's the reason I'm asking you, because I probably have listeners who have a specialized focus. So they're just like, why is no one talking about this? Why isn't this a thing?
and that's the call for them. That's the call for all of us. But I am a medial woman. I read about this 10 years ago, and this man was bashing it. And it's like, no, I need to reclaim this. I need to bring it forward so that others can hear the word.
That it might be inexplicable why that might be coming through or coming up for them, but like you said, it's calling them, it's part of their path, it's
I was called by name by Irene Claremont de Castillo. She used the word, and I knew it was my name. And then I wanted, in my book especially, to invite people to hear that name and see if it called to them,
mhm,
because most people haven't heard it. And
mhm.
I think it's very powerful for people who are medial.
Is it okay if I read a part of your book here that just really struck me when we're talking, when I was trying to like, okay, I can't wait to dive in and see why this word speaks to me already, and I wanted, to get some backup on why, and I'm just gonna read this part. You were quoting from The Knowing Woman, so that author, Irene Claremont de Castillo. She said, "To mediate is to be a connecting link between two things, holding out a hand to each as it were helping them to come to terms. A medial woman," and this is that's the end quote video, like a medial woman stands with a foot in each world,
and bridges the opposites, or she restores lost worlds to those who have forgotten these. For the medial, one foot stands in the visible, tangible world, and the other foot in the unseen, collective, unconscious realm. I thought that was a really beautiful, like, first I was quoting Irene and then I was quoting you, but like, I just love that visual of walking between worlds or like having one foot in the unseen and intangible and then a foot in the known. Let me ask you this before we dive a little deeper into the media women. Like, why do you think, I mean, okay, well, let me back up to even not why do you think, but do you feel like there's a lot more medial women now than there were in times past? And if so, why do you think that is?
My hunch is that there have always been medial women. There were more roles in times past for medial women. They were shamans and sibyls and seers, and we have fewer roles now. So my sense is that medial women have gone underground, which is why I called it stepping out of the shadows. That they've gone underground, but and I think that there are more medial women than we even have a clue. Everybody has some mediality in them, and men too. I'm married to a medial man. This just happened to come from a study that was on women almost a century ago. But I think that we need to be called forth. The other thing with medial women is that there's so many wounds, and we've all probably had experiences where we weren't understood and we were put down or banished in some way. Rather, most of us, well, we're all highly intuitive. Many of us are introverts. And when the world wounds us, we back, go back. So my book is hoping to name some of the wounds and to call people forward. One of the wounds I had was when I was serving a church, I had a district superintendent who came to see me, and he was new and asked me what kind of ministry I loved and wanted to do. And I said, oh, all the spiritual work, the pastoral work, prayers, the prayer groups, the classes. And
Mhm.
he said, oh, well, that's just the whipped cream. What do you really want to do? He was an administrator and an extrovert. I mean, it's like, wow, to
Mm.
talk about the spiritual life of
He was
people
just making it
who
fluffy, that's the
as
fluffy part.
whipped cream. I was so offended. And that would be one reason why I feel like this book needs to come forward.
Uh,
Everybody's had something like that.
oh, yes. In my religion of origin, which is Mormonism, I think I may have even expressed this to you, like, and to this day, women don't really have authority. Being born a woman means that you are of necessity to be presided over by a priesthood male, both in your home and at church and at activities and other things. And you talked about when you were a little girl that you wanted to go to church and that even though your family wasn't going, my family was very religious. And so we went and I really enjoyed it. It wasn't until and I did recognize quite early that women didn't really have power. And I don't mean power in the sense of power over. I mean power with, which it feels medial to me. You know, we're
Oh,
all
yeah.
together. We're all in the, but I'm curious how that came for you because you were in ministry and you did have spiritual leadership in a religious capacity.
Yeah.
And that isn't very common with a lot of people that I meet or women that I meet. I can count on one hand how many women ministers I've actually talked to in my life. I've
Really?
talked to a lot of people. So, but your husband was with you in the ministry, and is that something that you're still doing? And do you had you mentioned that you were confronted with the whipped cream thing by a superintendent or whatever, but was there any pushback for you in terms of being in that visibility and having that you could call it the robes or the cloak of authority or power, which I think is beautiful that you were seasoned and matured into that. Is that something you're still doing or
We're retired, but we have a church that we attend. It's a Japanese heritage church. That's
mm,
just lovely. And my husband's been working with food distribution, and I've been doing pastoral care. I just finished a group on holding space for grief. And those are the places I'm called: spiritual care, being with people who were dying,
mhm,
uh, Death is the limit, life and death. It's standing between where we are and what we don't know. And medial women, I mean, there are some medial women who are clairvoyant and have the ability to move back and forth between those realms. One of them is in my book. I interviewed her and she's very interesting. That's not my gift, but I am gifted at standing with people at their last breath. And it's an incredibly holy moment, and time and space opens up. There's a whole dimension to that when someone is dying.
Mm,
And that's where I'm called. And I still can do that in this new church, even in retirement.
that's beautiful.
Yeah.
We never did get to talk about a really powerful story in your book about the cherries. Do we want to bring that in as we're coming back into liminal space and how you happened upon a woman who shared this with you? I think it was really beautiful
Okay. Well, this is my story from the church where I was serving in ministry.
that the woman that you were working with, sorry.
She was a member of our church, Victoria, and I was with her family at her bedside as she was dying in the skilled nursing facility. And she wasn't feeling very well, but I could tell her spirit was quite alive. And her dinner tray arrived, and there was a sandwich and a salad and milk and cherries. And she was only willing to eat the cherries, although she really, really wanted to have watermelon. So we ordered some watermelon. And I took the cherries and fed them to her until the watermelon arrived. And then several of us took turn feeding the watermelon to her. And then she wanted more cherries. And she wanted me to feed these to her. And about this time, her sister encouraged me to leave and for her sons to feed her. But I sensed that she needed just a few more minutes. So I requested 5 minutes of cherries. Her family was afraid that as her pastor, that and she had told me that she was going to pay some donations into a parking lot fee, and they were afraid I was going to get her to change her will or something, which was the last thing I was ever thinking. It was very transactional from the perspective of her family and a little hostile. But they did leave when I said I'd like 5 minutes of cherries, and she and I laughed about 5 minutes of cherries and what that meant. It's an odd way to measure cherries and an odd way to measure time. So I continued to cut them and feed them to her. And soon she began reaching into the bowl and taking them in her fingers and dripping juice up the front of her nightgown and way up to her mouth and then popping them in. And during those 5 minutes of cherries, she and I talked for the last time. We didn't talk about money for the parking lot, and that was totally irrelevant. We talked about her life and we talked about her death and the deepest longings of her heart. And sometimes in the past, I often asked her that. Her deepest longings were that she would have time to finish up her business or for the well being of her family. But this night, it was a prayer, her deepest longings of her heart. So she prayed, "Thank you for giving me everything I have ever needed or wanted. Thank you, God." And I also prayed a prayer of thanksgiving, and we held each other over that 5 minutes over a bowl of cherries. And we both knew that we touched the edge of eternity, and all the restlessness and the transactionalness and the linearness and the hostility of life just rested. And it's like I will always remember when eternity rested on a bowl of cherries.
Mhm. So,
That's a medial story, and it's the story of a lemon.
mhm. And don't you feel like we are always, I don't want to say positioned or led, maybe a better word is we're led, or people are led to us, or we're led to people where we can serve as time benders or
Mm.
opening up the liminal space for people if we really have ears to hear and eyes to see that we can be God's hands, we can be that person who helps midwife. I always like the archetype of the midwife.
It's the same middle, midwife, medial. It's the same
Same,
kind of word, isn't it?
yes, the middle, you know.
Right.
So that's a beautiful story. When we're talking about archetypes, that there's four archetypes, other kinds of women besides. Do you want to kind of name what Tony Wolff talks about the different archetypes of women and how this is
It-
different from medial?
Hey, just a little break in our episode to let you know that those of you who were on the wait list for the Women's Wisdom Circle, that registration is now live. So this is a 6-month sacred circle for women wayshowers. We are going to begin our journey on spring equinox, March 19th. We will end our journey on autumnal equinox, September of this year. Go to standspeakshine.com/WWC, or you can just go to my website, cherieburton.com, and you'll see it there on the homepage to find out more. So excited. I actually slashed the price in less than half of what I was going to charge. And so it will include 20-minute clarity call with me, as well as some fun soul declaration cards that I'll ship to you. You will also get 6 months free of my new Mind, Body, Soul membership. So once again, that's cherieburton.com or standspeakshine.com/WWC. It's going to be glorious alchemy and transformation. I hope you can join us.
Toni Wolf's archetypes, and she was very close to Carl Jung, so they come from that era. And she talk about a repressed woman. She didn't get to do much. This is probably her biggest contribution, though she was brilliant. She said there were 4 feminine structural forms. There was the mother, and that's the one that nurtures whatever is needy or weak or becoming. And we know that one in our culture, but that's very common. There's the lover. She called it a hetara, which comes from the Greek word for a very high class whore who really took care of these men. And it was not the way we use whore, but I like to use the word lover. The one whose energy is devoted to a man. Third one is the Amazon, which is highly independent, very goal oriented, linear. I tend to think of it as extroverted, but it's probably not always extroverted, but kind of out in the world and moving ahead and linear. And then the fourth one is the medial. And the medial and the Amazon are both more individual. They relate to people, but their archetype is more individual. The mother and the lover, it's in relationship to
Right,
someone else.
right.
Yeah.
Which I don't know. As I was listening to you, I'm like, I think I might be all of those.
I
You
think
know,
we are.
I think we all have aspects of those, right? We all have aspects of all the archetypes.
But I think Toni Wolf and I have a slightly different understanding of the development. But my sense, I love the Wordsworth poem about trailing clouds of glory. The child comes trailing clouds of glory. It's like coming into this world with all this unseen that they know and we don't. I think we come into this world with a particular dominant structural form, and the world doesn't understand those. The parents don't understand any of it. I mean, I always thought was the mother. I mean, I had 3 younger brothers, and I was in charge a lot. And a pastor of a church, there's Mother Church. My husband and I were kind of seen as mother and father of,
And you have children as well. You are a
j-
mother.
I have children. So the mother was taking care of, that's what I learned from my mother. She was a nurse and taking care of the wounded. It wasn't until I was in my 40s that I ever even got a glimpse that I wasn't the mother, that my predominant archetype was always medial. I lived 40 years plus under an archetype that was not my primary archetype, and I never really got affirmation for the medial. I had to kind of go around the edges to find where to use that. Toni Wolf says that you use your first one and then you bring in a second one and then a third one. I
Mm,
think that's really culturally conditioned. There are probably some children who know their medial from the beginning. They're just so different. I didn't know that. I just knew
yeah,
I was different.
yeah.
But the culture can honor tomboys and mothers and flirting teenagers. The culture honors all that. It just doesn't have a place for the medial.
So if somebody is feeling like, hey, I feel like I might be medial, I feel like I want to claim that or explore that. What I know your book goes into that a little bit, but just off the top of your head, what would you say to that person who is feeling called there to explore that?
Oh, read my book.
Yeah. Or is there a practice? Is there a specific way that you cultivate that? I mean, aside from reading, which of course we'll have a link to your book and where people could find that, but what has been a way for you to really step into that and own that and cultivate that?
I think having the name is important. And then I have found that there are these transcendent moments that I can offer to myself by allowing myself to be in a place of transcendence, whether it's on a retreat, whether it's by the ocean or on a mountaintop, where one, whether it's reading something that's deep, whether it's in a relationship like a spiritual direction relationship, although I don't think all spiritual directors are medial people. They probably have some sense of that. I find nature to be so powerful, but quietness, to be still and to listen deeply, meditation. I do walking meditations. I pray while I walk. I like to walk alone so that I can pray. And I allow those prayers not to be words from me to God, but I allow them to be whatever comes, to follow it and to move with it. And that becomes a prayer.
Yeah. I once heard someone say that, like, for people who feel a strong devotional pull to the divine and however they define that, that their whole lives are a prayer. And I even heard a spiritual teacher say that our brains are actually wired to pray. They're
Mm.
wired to speak to the other realm. And it's kind of this subconscious sort of practice, but it's like, who am I really talking to? Am I talking to myself? Like we are wired to have this inner conversation or this inner dialogue and to ask and to long for and to connect.
And that's the media within each of us. Everybody, I think everybody has all four of those archetypes, and that we tap into the medial. I think some people have more of a dominant medial, but I think what you're talking about is, yeah, all of our brains are wired that way.
Yeah. And we're all spiritual beings before we are physical beings. And I think we're just trying to figure out these bodies and what's going on here. And so I know you teach a little bit about there are some dangers that are associated with being a medial. What would you say are the risk factors there?
Well, I think that the quality of mediality that can cause the greatest wounding and danger is that we are very porous. We take in everything, whether it's another person's feelings or the world. I mean, this is a devastating time right now as we're talking with the war in Gaza. We are so porous that unless we have solid boundaries, we can take in too much and then we can be overwhelmed, or we can take in that which is evil. And unless the boundaries are solid, we can be so empathic that we can get led astray into something that is not good. And we need to again, boundaries are so important for medial people
It's been
because
a lifelong process for me to establish boundaries because I can feel the intent of people. This is my little story of being a girl. I could feel people's intentions when I was a very little girl, and I didn't realize that that's what I was doing. I could discern whether they had ill intent, neutral intent, or good intent.
Mhm,
And it's just something that I came with.
mhm,
And so in some ways it served me really well. I feel like, when we're talking about being open and porous and empathic, have you ever heard of the term highly sensitive people, HSPs? Yeah.
mhm.
I'm assuming a lot of that is very medial as well, but it's just being like highly, highly attuned to what's going on in the subtle realms
Right.
in what is felt. You could call it vibration or frequency too, but you make the distinction between being vivid and being subtle when it comes to the media. Do you want to explore that just a little bit?
Sure. I think many of us are subtle medial. Those are my words, not Tony Wolf's. But the subtle medial is one, what you're describing, who has this sense of attunement in the world to people, to that which is unspoken. She's to deeper realities, and she just knows and doesn't know how she knows. It's because it's not a rational knowing, but it's a very subtle knowing and attunement. The vivid medial are the women who experience, I could also call them clear medial, because the word clair, like clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, There's even a clairgoustience, which is clear tasting. But
Oh,
these
I think I might have that.
I I had never heard about that one, but,
I haven't
uh,
either.
but a couple of the women I interviewed were very vivid and clear medial. And they're the ones who can find a body. The police, there's a plane crash and the police can't find the plane. They can get into a realm, they can find the plane and whether there are bodies in it. One of them had that experience. And some of those, one of them had the experience of crossing life and death and boundaries and had regular conversations with angels. She sat with me and she said, "You have an angel. Her name is Mabel." And I sometimes talk to Mabel. This is not a realm. I don't have that clear clairvoyant,
Oh,
but
yours
I
is more of this on the subtle spectrum.
subtle. And I think most of us are. Of the five of us whose stories I wrote, three were subtle and two had more of the clear. I
Mhm.
think, and I think the clear are even more hidden because they freak people out. People don't trust them. And that is one of the
There's
dangers.
a skepticism in our culture with people who have very clear gifts
Uh-huh. And
because it bumps up against, that linearity and that logical that we've
even with
upheld in our culture as like the norm or the right way.
yeah, well, even with the subtle gifts. I mean, I always felt sort of stupid when I was a kid because I wasn't, but they didn't understand my way of thinking. I just
Yeah,
had a different way of being. Um,
yeah.
And you asked about the dangers. This one other that I think is one of the biggest is that people can get lost when you move into a very deep place, like
Mhm.
meditation, a trance, or a sense of communion with the divine. One can get lost there. And so the limit to come back, I mean, that's we're on the other side of the spiritual limit there. It's very hard to come back. I came back after a retreat and coming back on the highway was like, oh my goodness. And then I came back to a dinner or something, and it's like I
Yeah.
just had to leave and I came home in tears. I couldn't get back. And I
So
think
I
that,
think what you're saying is it's really easy to dissociate because you feel that pull to the transcendental and you have that experience. Then you have to come home and get grounded. I feel like being grounded is probably the most important spiritual practice,
absolutely.
because you're still connected to the unseen and you're still receiving, but you're also here now, present. And that's an art, I think.
And we move back and forth. I'm thinking of Jack Kornfield's book, After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. I think that's kind of what we feel, you
Welcome
know.
to womanhood.
Yeah,
I
right.
wanted to read this other part by Jungian analyst that you quoted in your book, Jungian analyst Marianne Mattoon, about she calls medial woman expresses, quote, vague and embryonic possibilities not acceptable to the dominant culture. That is, these women are sensitive to currents of thoughts and feelings not perceived by most people, but which become apparent in the future. Because these contents are still unconscious to most people, they often appear to be dark, negative, and dangerous.
Mm.
And I loved that reading that, and I'll tell you why. Because, and this is why I love your book, Stepping Out of the Shadows, because I've been doing a lot of shadow work in recent years. And a lot of what I was feeling in my body was the dissonance of what wasn't right in the system and culture that I was immersed in and born into. So I felt a pull which to lift the lid, to look underneath the surface, to shine a little flashlight into this little dark corner that no one was talking about. Lots of dark corners, actually. And when she said, this part about because these contents are still unconscious to most people, they often appear to be dark, negative, and dangerous. And I was getting, just this admonition, well, stay in the light, stay on the path, stay safe. And that's not where my soul was calling me. My soul was calling me into those shadow realms to look at it and see it and love it and face it, but not to keep turning away from it because I could feel in my body that those shadows were creating a lot of patterns of behavior in people that were not healthy, and that I needed to sit with it and feel it and notice it and observe it. And then it has become part of my path to sort of bring messaging to it, to give voice to it, to really bring it to the table for discussion.
Sounds like it's part of your call. And medial people, one of our values is that we, or one of our calls is that we have to bring it forward. We can't just get lost there. We have to bring it forward. The picture on the cover of my book is of Persephone.
Stunning.
Isn't she sweet? That's Persephone. And if I hope people know that story because she is abducted into the underworld. So she spends a lot of time in the shadows. It's her mother who's just beside herself, Demeter. But then she comes back up, but because she's eaten three pomegranate seeds, she has to go back for 3 months every year. So we move, even Persephone moves back and forth, but we have to be able, if we're medial, to be able to step out of the shadows. And it in the Greek mythology is a story of the seasons, but I think it's a story of the psyche.
Mm,
Um, the shadows are always going to be there, and we need to not be afraid of moving back into the shadows. And we get to know what they're like, but we have to come out and tell what we've known there, and that's what you're doing.
mm.
And
It
that's
reminds me also of the myth of Inanna, the goddess Inanna, the Sumerian goddess who went to the underworld and felt the call to the underworld. And as soon as I heard that story like 5 years ago, I was like, yep, that's exactly what's happening to me. I can no longer not go to the underworld. It's just such a strong pull to go through the death rebirth cycle. And of course, and you talk about limon being death, and it reminds me of the death rebirth cycle, that we will have these mini deaths or all these, I guess, a series of awakenings throughout our life that, if we're not open, if we're not in face of openness and receiving and noticing, then we'll just think bad things are happening to us. We'll just, we won't have that perspective. And that's why myths and archetypes are so powerful because they give us that visual and that landing and anchoring into what might be happening for us.
And I think people are terrified of the dark, of the depth, of the underworld. I know my mother was always afraid when I was a child or in college, even. I wanted to go to Mississippi and register voters. I did go in the spring of 64, but I wanted to go back and register voters. My parents refused,
That's
and
brave.
people people were killed then. But I think my parents were afraid that where I felt my call was too dangerous and I would be destroyed. And they were probably wise in restraining me until I could find the way that I uniquely was called, which wasn't perhaps registering voters in 1964, but I do feel like I've been through dangerous times and I've come through. Depression is one of the things medial women experience.
Yeah, I loved reading that in your book, and that's where I kind of want to wrap as we move, through because
Yeah.
for me, I was diagnosed with something called dysthymia when I was 19, and by the time 21 is when I got diagnosed. By the time I was 21, my actually preparing to serve a mission for my church, and so I had to, go through all these things to get ready. And the psychiatrist in San Francisco, he's like, "You've been dysthymic your entire life, your entire childhood." And that was just my baseline because I was trying to stabilize my environment. I was, trying to adjust, and it just created kind of this inner chronic like numbness or not necessarily dissociation, but it was just a very mild chronic low grade depression. It wasn't just like high highs and low lows. I wasn't in bed for weeks. It wasn't a traditional clinical depression. But I can tell you that that's almost the entire reason that I went into the field of psychology to get my degree. And then most of my career has been on understanding the dynamic nature of emotions and how we hold them in our bodies. And that it's just
Mhm.
really interesting that that was one of the markers of a medial because I always thought there was something wrong with me that I was in that chronic, sort of low grade depression space, but maybe you can enlighten some of our listeners. For some, it might be anxiety or something along this they're on the same spectrum really, but Yeah, why don't you explore that with us just a little bit?
Well, I went through profound depression when I felt like I couldn't, when I didn't really know that I was medial, and I felt like I couldn't escape. It was like the church was falling apart from there's nothing wrong with the church. It was just I was growing in a new direction. We didn't have money to send me to school. I mean, I didn't know how I was going to be able to develop this new part that was just it burst forth.
This is
It's
like in your 40s? Is this the time period you're talking about?
my 40s. My psyche took over, my dreams took over, and I went into analysis for a long time. And the depression, I think, was the voice of my psyche saying, there's something more here that you have to work on, or you will be sick. And I do think our psyches do that to us. And our dreams tell us, even the nightmares tell us important things. I think media women feel like your comment, there's something wrong with me. I've gotten comments, I've gotten letters from people who say, I always thought there was something wrong with me. And it's such a relief to know maybe there's not. Our culture so doesn't understand this, and we pathologize it because we can't hold it as a psychological, spiritual way of being in the world.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that because there are a lot of people now coming out and talking about, embracing your individuality and understanding how you're built and like human design and gene keys and astrology. And there's just a lot of people, they're just like, this is who I am. This is how I'm built. This is how I came into the world. This is the way I incarnated. This is my build. This is my makeup. So I am hopeful that there are less people that are underground and that there are more people coming out of the shadows, and work like you're doing, I think is really affirming and really timely, because I don't know if it'll happen in our lifetime, but I think we're going to start to see some major critical mass shifts in the way people move in the world, and what we value as a culture, and how we allow people to manifest their inherent gifts. But I would love for you, Bobbie, to just maybe close us out with a reading. I know you have a prayer that you love to express. And, however, just, for those listeners who may not consider themselves religious or whatever, this really isn't religious. It's just a way of communicating with the divine and the all. And so I would love for you to round us out with that.
I need to say before I do that, that the word prayer and the word dream for me, I am always getting them mixed up. So if I write a prayer for a church service or something, I may say to my husband, I just finished writing a dream.
Oh, I love that. That's great.
Or I'll wake up in the morning and I said I had the most incredible prayer last night. I think it's because they both come from that same deep unconscious place.
Yeah.
This is my prayer for women at the limit. It's the end of my book. Deep mystery, divine spirit, sacred other, source of all, ground of being, God, you beyond name, concept, or words, you to which medial women are connected, we lift this prayer. May our limen be the edge of your hand. Hold us in your open palm, not too tightly that we might be crushed, not too lightly that we might slip off. May we find courage in the darkness that we travel, discernment in what is ours to know and carry, wisdom to leave what is not ours behind, balance between the one foot on this side and the one foot on the other. May our culture grow from encasement to the old ways, through the chaos of disruption into new forms that are permeable enough to embrace ancient wisdom as well as new ways of being. May there be room for our gifts among the gifts of those many others so very different, all of which are needed, so that we can live into the fullness of our beings, so that we can be heard amidst clatter and clutter. May we find respect among other women, those who carry swords, those who carry babies, those who carry hearts, as we carry insights and hidden truths. May we acknowledge our wounds. May they not create of us victims. May we claim our gifts. May they not create in us arrogance. We are becoming ever more the self we have been from birth. Use us in service to the greater whole. May our being make a difference in creation. So may it be.
So may it be. Thank you so much, Bobbie. That was just beautiful. I wanted to just remind the listeners to grab your book, Stepping Out of the Shadows, Naming and Claiming the Medial Woman Today. And it did win a Nautilus Book Award, which I can totally see why.
Thank you.
Very, very well researched and written and put together. And of course, your soul is all over through this book as I've gotten to know you. So thank you so much for your offering to this world and for being with our listeners today.
Thank you, Cherie, for having me, for inviting me. It's been a real privilege. And I hope this book will just find the people who need it. I trust that.
And people can find, I do too, and people can find your book on Roberta B. Corson.com. So that's RobertaBcorson.com. So thank you again.
Thank you, Cherie.
Hey, it's Cherie here. Have you gotten my free whole body healing kit mini course? All you have to do is ask to join our private Facebook group, Soul Rose Community, and we'll send it right to your inbox. And I want you to know that I am so grateful for every single one of you who listens to these episodes. You can follow me on Instagram at cherie.burton to deepen into the discussion that you heard today. And I would be ever so grateful if you would leave this podcast a positive review on Apple Podcasts. This allows many more people to find these kinds of healing and empowerment gems that we bring forward in our discussions. And if you want to see our faces, check out my Soul Rose Show YouTube channel. Have a glorious week, and we'll talk to you next time on the Soul Rose Show.